must have fallen asleep because I jump when the prison doors open. Get him out, someone says to the guard. And then Ochre appears in front of the cell, watching the guard unlock the door. You, Ochre says. Time to get back to work. I glance at the cell across from me. Cassia hasn't come in. Did she spend the whole night watching over Kai? Or have they made her work all this time? Although the prisoners are quiet, I can hear them breathing, but no one else seems to be awake. When we get outside, I see it's dark and not even early morning yet. You're working for me, Ochre says. So you keep the same hours I do. He points at the research lab across the way. That's mine, he says. Do what I say and you can spend most of your days in there instead of locked up. If Lena's the physic of the village, I think Ochre is the pilot. Follow my instructions exactly, he tells me. All I need are your hands since mine don't work. Ochre isn't much for introductions. One of the assistants says after Ochre leaves. I'm Noah. I've worked with Ochre since he came here. Noah looks to be somewhere in his middle 30s. This is Tess. Tess nods to me. She's a little younger than Noah and has a kind smile. I'm Xander, I say. What's all this? One of the walls of the lab is covered with pictures of people I don't know. Some are old photos and pages torn from books, but most look like they might have been drawn by hand. Did Ochre do that before his hand stopped working right? Impressed that it makes me think of the nurse back in the medical center. Maybe I am the only one who won't make things, pictures, poems without any training. Ochre calls them the heroes of the past, Noah says. He believes we should know the work of those who came before us. He's trained in the society, didn't he? I say. Yes, Tess says. He came here 10 years ago, right before his final banquet. He's 90? I ask. I've never known anyone so old. Yes, Noah says. The oldest person in the world as far as we know. The office door slams open, and we all get back to work. A few hours later, Ochre tells his assistant to take a break. Not you, he says to me. I need to make something and you can stay and help me with it. Noah and Tess send me sympathetic looks. Ochre sets a bunch of neatly labeled boxes and jars in front of me and hands me a list. Put this compound together, he says, and I start measuring. He goes back over to the cabinet and rummages through more ingredients. I hear them clanking together. Then, to my surprise, he starts talking to me. You said you saw approximately 2,000 patients while you worked in the medical center in Cadmus, he says. Over the course of 4 months, yes, I say. There were many more patients that I didn't treat, of course, in the other parts of the center and other buildings in Cadmus. Out of the ones you did see, how many looked better when they were still than my patients here? He asked. None, I say. That's a fast answer, he says. Take your time to think it over. I think back to all the patients. I can't remember everyone's face, but I can call up the last 100 and Lee, of course. None, I say. Ochre folds his arms and sits back satisfied. He watches me measure a few more ingredients. All right, I say. Now you can ask a question. I didn't expect the opportunity, but I'm going to take advantage of it. What's the difference between the bag you make and the ones the Rising uses? I ask. Ochre pushes the container towards me. Have you ever heard of Alzheimer's disease? That's a question, not an answer. But I go along with it. No, I say. Of course not, Ochre says, because I cured it before you were born. You cured it? I say. Just you, no one else? Ochre tacks a couple of the pictures on the wall behind him. Not by myself. I was part of a research team in society, and the disease clogged up the brain with extra proteins. Others before us had worked on the project, but we figured out a way to control the level of expression of the protein. We shut them down. He leans a little closer and looks at the compound I've made. So, to answer your first question, the difference is that I know what I'm doing when I put together the medication. Unlike the Rising, I know how to help and keep some of the proteins from the mutation from accumulating because they act in a way that is similar to the disease we cured. I know how to keep the patient's platelets from accumulating in the spleen, and the patients don't rupture and bleed internally. The other difference is that I don't include as many necrotics in my solution. My patients feel some pain, not agony, more like discomfort. It reminds them to breathe, more likely to get them back that way. But is that a good thing? I asked. What if they can feel all the pain of the boils? Ogre snorts. If they feel something, they fight, he says. If we're in the place with no pain, why would you want to come back? He slides a tray of powder in my direction. Measure this out, distill it in the solution. I look down at the instructions and measure 2 grams of the powder into the liquid. Sometimes I can't believe this. Ochre mutters. I can't tell if he's talking to himself or not. But then he glances in my direction. Here I am working on a cure for that damn plague again. Wait, I say, you worked on the first cure? He nods. The society knew about the work we'd done in the protein expression. They pulled my team to work on the cure for the plague. Before society sent out to the enemy, they wanted to make sure that the cure in case the plague came back. So the Rising lied, I said. Society did have a cure. Of course they did, Ochre says. Not enough for the pandemic, so the Rising gets credit for making more. But the society came up with a cure first. I bet your pilot didn't mention that. He didn't, I say. I paid a considerable amount for my escape here, Ochre says. The current pilot is the one who brought me out. Ochre walks to look over for something else in the cupboard. That was before he was the Rising pilot, he says, his voice muffled. When the Rising asked him to leave, I told him not to believe them. They're no rebellion, they're a society with a different name, and they just want you and your followers, I said. But he was so sure it would work. Ochre comes back to the table. Maybe he wasn't that sure. He says he kept notes of where I was in Edstone. So Ochre was part of the vanishing, and Lee told me about. Did that bother you? I asked him, keeping track of you like that. No, Ochre says. I wanted to be out of society, and I was. I don't mind feeling useful now and then here. He hands me a datapod, scrolls through the list for me. As I do, he grumbles. Can they narrow it down any more? We all assume that it's something environmental. Well, we eat anything we can find or grow. It's a long list. We'll find something to help them, but it might not be in time. Why didn't the pilot bring you into Cadmus or Central? I asked. That would be a better place to work on the cure. They could bring you supplies and plants from the mountain. In Providence, you have access to the data and equipment. Ochre's base is rigid. Because I agreed to work with him on one condition only, he says, I stay right here. I nod. Once you get out, Ochre says, you don't go back. His hands look so old, like paper covering bones. But the veins stand out, fat and with life and blood. I can tell you have another question, he says, his voice annoyed with interest in the same time. Ask it. The pilot told us that someone contaminated the water supplies, I say. Do you think they also created the mutation? They both happened so fast. It seems like the mutation could have been manipulated, just like the outbreak was. That's a good question, Ochre says. But I bet that the mutation occurred naturally. Some genetics change take place regularly in nature, but unlike there is an advantage conferred by the mutation. It is simply lost because the non-mutated version premeditated. Points to another jar, and I take it down from him and unstop the lid. But if some kind of selective pressure is present and that confers an advantage to a mutation, the mutation ends up outgrowing and surviving the non-mutated form. That's what the virologist back in Cadmus told me, I say. He's right, Ochre says, at least to my thinking. He also told me that it was likely the cure itself applied the selective pressure and caused the mutation. It's likely, Oker says, but even so, I don't think anyone planned that part. It was, as we who lived outside of society sometimes says, bad luck. One of the mutations was immune to the cure, and so it flourished and caught on. Oker confirmed it. The cure caused the real pandemic. I've gotten ahead of myself, Oker says. I haven't yet told you why the virus works. You figured some of it out by yourself, but the best way to explain it. His tone was dry. If it refers to a story, 1 in 100, in fact number 3, do you remember it? Yes, I say. I actually do. I've always remembered it because the girl's name, Zaith, sounds a little like my own. Tell it to me, Oker says. The last time I tried to tell a story was to Lee and it didn't go well at all. I wish I'd done better for her, but I'll try again because now Oker asked me to do it, and I think he's going to be the one to figure out the cure. I have to try and keep from smiling. It's going to happen. We're going to do it. The story's about a girl named Zaith, I say. One day she decides she didn't want to eat her own food. When the meal delivery came, and she snatched her father's oatmeal and ate that instead. But it was too hot, and all day long Zaith felt sick and feverish. The next day she stole her mother's oatmeal, but it was too cold. Zaith shook with chills. On the 3rd day she ate her own meal, and it was just right. She felt fine. I stopped. Pretty stupid story, meant to remind society's kids to do what they're told. It goes on and on like that, I tell Oker. She ends up with 3 citations for improper behavior before she realizes that society was right for her. To my surprise, Oker nods. Good enough, he says. The only part you forgot was the part about her hair. Right, I say. It was gold. That's why her name is Zaith. Means. Doesn't matter anyway, Oker says. The important thing is the idea that something could be too hot or too cold and just right. That's what we need to remember about when the way the virus works. It uses something, and I think as a strategy. The virus doesn't want to run out of targets too quickly. It kills the organism it affects, and it kills too fast. It needs to be able to transfer to another organism in time. So the virus kills everything too quickly, I say. It's too hot. And if it doesn't move to another organism fast enough and it dies, Oker says too cold. But somewhere in the middle, I say, is just right. Oker nods. The mutation, he says, was just right, and not only because society and the rising and what they each did, they contributed to some of the conditions, yes. But the virus mutated on its own. The virus has done for years what has been plagues all throughout history, and that won't end with this one. So we're never really safe, I say. Oh no, my boy, Oker says almost gently. That might be the society's greatest triumph, that so many of us ever believed that we were.